That's what she does. She was a Yiddish teacher. She was fabulous. That's what all our former students tell me. So that's great. So we have, we're recording. I thought we were going to record from there and we were going to get the back of everybody's head plus the, but no, it's maybe better from here. That's good. I'm going to talk this way and this way. They were kind enough to set up the keyboard for me because there's some songs that we need to do as we talk about some of the greatest Hanukkah stories that are never told. So what does that mean? Well, we'll find out, hopefully. When you ask people my age about a Hanukkah song, I think that they think of, I think they think of this one to get us started. If you don't know it, it's okay. The festival of lights. Instead of one day of presents, we have 8 crazy nights. But when you feel like the only kid in town without a Christmas tree, here's a list of people who are Jewish, just like you and me. The Menorah. So do James Caan, Kirk Douglas, and the late Dinah Shore. Kirk Douglas, I think, has died too now. He's going to have to. Yeah. Guess who eats together at the Carnegie Deli? Bowser from Chanukah and Arthur Fonzarelli. Paul Newman's half Jewish. Goldie Hawn's half too. Put them together, what a fine-looking Jew. You don't need Deck the Halls or Jingle Bell Rock, 'cause you can spin the dreidel with Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock, both Jewish. Put on your yarmulke, it's time for Hanukkah. The owner of the Seattle Supersonicas celebrates Hanukkah. O.J. Simpson, not a Jew, but guess who is? Hall of Famer Rod Carew, he converted. We got Ann Landers and her sister dear Abby. Harrison Ford's a quarter Jewish, not too shabby. Some people think that Ebenezer Scrooge is, well, he's not, but guess who is? All 3 Stooges. So many Jews are in showbiz. Tom Cruise isn't, but I heard his agent is. Tell your friend Veronica it's time to celebrate Hanukkah. I hope I get a harmonica on this lovely, lovely Hanukkah. So drink your gin and tonica, smoke your marijuana. If you really, really wanna have a happy, 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 happy Hanukkah. So it's time for Hanukkah.
That was Adam Sandler's.
That's Adam Sandler, right? So Adam Sandler wrote that. So it's not just fun. It's a generational kind of thing. He wrote that sometime in the 90s. But it's a fun way to get into it. We're going to talk about Hanukkah. But what Adam Sandler was trying to do, I think, was trying to update Hanukkah for himself, right? Especially for people. I love that line. If you feel like you're missing out on Christmas, let's get excited about Hanukkah. So this will kind of set the tone for what we're talking about. So I told Laura, I told the gang here that it's the greatest Hanukkah stories never told. And what I mean by that is, there are, I think everybody has a sense of the story of Hanukkah, right? We know the story of Hanukkah, or we at least think we know the story of Hanukkah. But there's a lot of things when it comes with Hanukkah, they're just around, like latkes and dreidels and menorahs and this business about the oil. And if you just kind of accept what they tell you when you're a little kid, you would never think twice. But you know what? There are some of these stories need a little bit of unpacking. So we'll get to it. But before we get to that, I wanted to tell you a story about a personal Chanukah story for me. So all my life growing up, we always did Hanukkah in my home, right? Hanukkah is a big home holiday, never really been a big synagogue holiday like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, but it's a home holiday. And we always kind of did the same sort of thing. One of the nights or two of the nights during Hanukkah or around Hanukkah, there would be a get-together with a few different groups of friends and their families. But by and large, we lit Hanukkah candles at home with my family. I've got a younger sister, my parents, the four of us. We usually had one Chanukah set up, and we did the candles, and we kind of did the same sort of thing every night. We light the candles, sing the blessings, sing Ma'od Sur. We're good. And then I had a very profound Hanukkah experience when I was 22 years old, and I moved away to go to university in Halifax. And that year, much like this year, Hanukkah fell very early on the calendar. It always falls on the same date on the Hebrew calendar, so it was on the English calendar, right, where it fell early. And it was early December, and it wasn't coinciding with the winter break, so I wasn't going to be home for Hanukkah. And I was tasked with, for the first time being 22, making my own Hanukkah, which I hadn't really thought about, and then it just kind of came up, and I thought, oh, I'm not going to be at home, I'm going to be doing Hanukkah on my own. So I went out to the synagogue, and I bought a Chanukah, and I found candles and a couple dreidels, and I was living in residence in my university, and there were 12 of us who lived together. And for most of the people, I was doing journalism, and for most of the people I lived with, and for most of the people in my program, most of them, I was their first Jewish person. It was very exciting for them. We've read about Jewish people and we've seen movies, but you're like, can I touch you? No one ever actually said that. Would have been weird if they had. But it was an interesting experience, right? Halifax, Nova Scotia has a pretty nice Jewish community, but it's a very transient Jewish community. It's not like Winnipeg. It's not like one of these towns that, for a lot of factors, but maybe because of its isolation, or people put down roots and there's many generations and this sort of thing. Halifax never really had a lot of that. People who, their families, let's say 3 or 4 generations ago, started in Halifax, they maybe lasted a generation or two, but there was always this idea of moving on to something a little bit bigger, something a little bit better, moving to Toronto, and there was access because it felt a little bit closer. And plus with the universities and professors and students kind of moving out and moving in, there's a lot of that city of Halifax, when you're 25, you're old, you know, and it's one of those kinds of towns. So it's very different from Winnipeg. Anyway, so I was making my first ever Hanukkah, and I was living in residence, and so every night, right before we put on Jeopardy, which I watched with a religious fervor that probably I should have put into Hanukkah, but whatever. I put up the candles, and I did, and every night there was a different collection of people. So every night I was telling the story, and I kind of got a little bit more into it. And I was talking about the miracle of the oil and everything, and I was light the candles, and people thought this was really great. And it's 5 to 10 minutes, so it's very accessible. And then we had like this area where I could light candles, and we wouldn't set off any smoke alarms, so it was all great. And like I said, there were different people pretty much every night, but there was one fellow, my good friend whom I lived with, who was the only person who was there for all 8 nights. And he became quickly my best friend I lived with. And years later, he came to my wedding, we stayed in touch, and he was from Grand Prairie, Alberta, and I was certainly the first Jewish person he had ever seen. And in spite of being from Grand Prairie, Alberta, he had a very interesting backstory. His dad was from Iraq, his mom, and was Muslim. His mom was very, very Roman Catholic and from Victoria, and his name was Hussein Vincent Al-Asadi. This was his name, Hussein Vincent Al-Asadi. And brilliant guy, great guy. He was there for every night of Hanukkah. And by the last night, I'm doing the candles, and I've told the story, and I kind of am starting to sing Ma'od Sur, which we always did in my house. I don't know if that's what you do when you finish the story. but finish the candles. But we always did Mausur, and I'm singing Mausur, and I look over, and Hussein is singing Mausur with me perfectly. He had never heard it in his life, and after 8 days, he had it. He was singing like that. He didn't know any of the words, right? Na, 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 na. Felt that my personal Hanukkah miracle was that I taught Hussein Vincent Al-Essedi in 8 days, 10 minutes a day, the tune to Mao's Sur. Made me very happy. So ever since, I was 22, ever since, I'm 36 now, I smile thinking about that first Hanukkah away, because when you're at home, you just take these things for granted, right? And then when you have to go out and forge the way you will practice Judaism when you have a family, it kind of creeps up on you and gets you thinking about the way you would do it, right? You don't necessarily have to do it the way your parents did, but I found a lot of joy in that, and I was able to kind of bring it and share it with a lot of people, and obviously made an impression. He asked me, what is this song all about? And I was kind of caught off guard because we had never learned a translation and I wasn't really sure. Mao's Sur, geez. Well, did you ever hear the English version? Rock of ages, let our song praise your saving power. You amid our raging foes were our sheltering tower. Furious they assailed us, but your arm availed us, and your word broke their sword when our own strength failed us. And your word broke their sword when our own strength failed us. I see, I didn't know those words at the time, so I told him, "Wow, Sur Yeshua T. It's a song of salvation." That's what Yeshua T means, right? Rock of Ages. In this case, doesn't say it, but Rock of Ages, Mao's Sur Yeshua T, our salvation. And he used to just, in the 10 minutes leading up to the Chanukah, Matt, are you doing the Chanukah candles? Matt, are you doing the Chanukah candle? Yeah, Hussein, it's like the 10-minute countdown. 10 minutes till we sing songs of salvation, everybody! Not exactly the way we would have done it at home, but singing songs of salvation with Hussein Al-Essedi. That's what I think about when I think of Hanukkah. Now, just quickly on Mao's Sur, we talk about stories never told. Mao's Sur was, they believe, written in the 13th century, in the 1200s. It was one of those things like Lecha Dodi, where in order to sign, the author to sign the poem and have people know, he used the first letter of every paragraph to spell out his name. So the 5 stanzas of Mao's Sur spell out Mordechai. It was written by some guy named Mordechai. My Hebrew name is Mordechai. It wasn't me, I promise you. I would have had something with maybe a minor or something, anyway. But the idea is that in the 1200s, this was a firmly established thing, and if you go through the many verses of Mao's Sur, really most people only sing the first one. It covers the story, it covers the miracle of oil, it covers the battle of the Maccabees. It's a historical review. They call it a piyut. You ever heard this term in Hebrew? A piyut. It's like a hymn. You ever say hymn? It's kind of like a hymn. Jews have hymns. Yeah, we got hymns for sure. We got hers too. Nice. I don't have a drum, so I have to, right? Okay, Rabbi Allen will be my drums. But that wasn't the only melody that there ever was. I don't know if you ever heard this, but years later we were doing some stuff with a band, and I came across this version that was written by an Italian fellow named Benedetto Marsetto, who composed a totally different feel for Mao's Sur that goes like this. Mao's Sur Yeshua Ti Lechana El Shabeach Tikon Beit Tefilati B'Sham Toda Nezabeach Egmor Beshir Mizmor Chanukah Egmor Beshir Mizmor Chanukah Very different feel, right? A very different feel from it. And it's another one of those examples how the same words, the music that you set are give a totally different feel to it. That version, I feel, brings more, it's got more drama. It's got more, because it's in a minor key, and it's got kind of like, there's some, maybe a little bit of pain behind there. And in fact, when you dive a little deeper, the story of Hanukkah has a little bit of pain behind it. I mean, we talk about some of that, but we don't always talk about it. What is the story of Hanukkah? The story that I was telling every night was the story that I kind of was fed growing up. And I have fed to many children in Brockford and Gray Academy, and it's the very digestible story of the Hanukkah, where there was this revolution. Jews were not being allowed to be Jews. The Greeks were these bad guys. And then they fought against them. They fought in the hills. They had elephants, but we had God on our side, and we did it. And we rededicated the temple, and Chanukah means dedication. And then they found this little bit of oil, and they were freaked out because they only had enough to last one day. Where were they going to get more oil in time? And then it burned for 8 days. So we light candles for 8 days. Who's heard the story? Right. That's the story, right? Wrong. Well, not wrong, but wrong. It's not totally true. The real story of Hanukkah is much darker and more, maybe even disturbing. Let me explain. I'm going to put this here. So, they say it happened 2,000 years ago. So I did a little bit of digging. So around 200 BCE, right? This is after Alexander the Great had built this massive, massive Greek empire. He died, and it kind of got divided into parts. And the part that Judea, which is now Israel and Palestine and everything, belonged to the Seleucid Empire, right? Do I say that right? Seleucus was one of the top military advisors, and his kingdom was based out of Antioch, which is in Syria, which is why sometimes you see the Syrians or the Syrian Greeks in stories, and no one ever explained, like Syria, Greece, they're nowhere near each other. Yeah, well, at that time, the Syrian portion of the empire extended from Syria east and west and included Judea. So, and there was all this fighting, right, because Egypt was run by Ptolemy, and they were worried about fighting each other, and then there was the Macedonians, the Greek part, whatever. The Seleucid Greeks were the ones who were in charge of, come on in! It's fine, no, don't worry. We were just chatting. The good part starts now. It's all good. The good part starts now. Right, so they were Greeks in the sense that they were part of this former Alexander the Great huge Greek empire, and there was a strong influence of Hellenization, which we've heard about, right? Everybody should be Greek. Look Greek, talk Greek, act Greek, wrestle in the nude like the Greeks, worship the Greek gods, all that kind of stuff. And the way the story was always told to me was that, like, from the top down, it was being kind of insisted upon, which that turns out isn't exactly necessarily true. So the Seleucid Empire is taking over in 200 BCE. 25 years later, Antiochus IV Epiphanes takes over as the king. Antiochus III, everybody kind of liked him. And a lot of people living in Israel, we'll call it Israel at the time, Judea, they accepted a lot of what the Greeks were selling. It wasn't that crazy. It wasn't this idea of everything was being forced on them, at least not at the beginning. The high priest at the time, he welcomed the construction of a gymnasium in Jerusalem, where there were wrestlers practicing and fighting in the nude. The Greek education system took hold. There were people worshiping Greek gods all over the place very willingly. A typical Judean would have worn Greek robes, would have been proficient in Greek language, even if he lived in the city or the country, rich or poor. He was a super pious religious person or totally not a follower, and into polytheism. Everybody was really absorbing some parts of Greek culture in some way or another. And it seemed to be okay. And the point is, it didn't really feel like a threat for even the more religious Jews. most Jews didn't see Hellenism as this enemy, at least not at the beginning. And they kind of like this idea of fitting into maybe a more global, right, a general kind of culture that was permeating the world. It's very interesting. It's not unlike what happens 2,000 years later today, right? The names that Jewish, talk about this, the names that Jewish immigrants sometimes would pick for their kids. They wanted them to have very English, very Canadian-sounding names, sometimes like that, right? Like he was Mottel in the shtetl, but here he's going to be Mark, or here he's going to be Matthew. He's really going to fit into society, something like that. So, where it turned, though, was, so that was 175. Antiochus IV takes over. Still okay. About 8 years later, 167 BCE, things got a little carried away. And it's hard to tell, actually, if you do a little digging. Was it this king away in Antioch who was insisting on these crazy rules, like no circumcision for anybody or that you face the death penalty? Desecrating the temple, which became very famous in the Chanukah story, sacrificing pigs, which they knew weren't kosher, putting an altar to Zeus on top of the altar that had been used for animal sacrifice for a few hundred years, letting prostitutes come and do their thing on the temple grounds. Was it the king who insisted upon this? Some people say that it actually came from a high priest working in Jerusalem at the time, a Kohen Gadol, named Menelaus. Right, by then there were Greek names, right, that had kind of taken over. So some people think that he did it on his own and then got some support from Antiochus to kind of have the military might of the empire back him. Some people think that he got orders from Antiochus. It's unclear. But what is clear is that this idea that it was all the Jews fighting against this oppressive Seleucid empire, these Syrian Greeks, really wasn't true. It was more true to say that it was like a civil war. It was Jews fighting against Jews, right? Because there were two groups of Jews. You could fit into two kind of camps. There were the Hellenists, sometimes called the Tobiads, because one of their leaders was a fellow named Tobias. They welcomed the changes of Greek culture, or they just didn't care. And then you had the Pietists, sometimes known as the Oniads, because there was an Onias, who was one of the leaders on that side, for them it was the last straw when they started messing with the temple. And in that group of the Pietists, you had this family of priests themselves. In English they call them the Hasmoneans. In Hebrew we call them the Hashmonaim. The father was this guy named Mattathias, also a Greek name, but we always say Matityahu. The Hebrew one, he had 5 sons, and one of those sons was named Yehudah, was named Judah. And he became known as Judah the Hammer, Judah the Maccabee, and they all became known as the Maccabees, and their followers became known as the Maccabees. But it was not this guarantee like the Jews were fighting against the Greeks. It wasn't really that simple. I think the Greeks got involved towards the end, and in the 3 years from 167 BCE to 164 BCE, there was a full-on war, but there were Jews fighting against Jews. And it was as much about politics and power and corruption and themes that should really not surprise anybody, that never really ever gets, or certainly for me growing up, got talked about in the Chanukah story, right? It was good against evil. It was them not letting us do our thing. Yeah, maybe not so much. The high priest before Menelaus was a fellow named Jason. Jason. Whoever thought there was a high priest named Jason? I always thought every high priest had to have like a very Hebrew name or a very Jewish name. But no, what a silly thing to think. 2,000 years ago, there were guys named Jason who were the high priest, who were acting very Greek, as much as they were acting very Jewish. And that's where the seed of the Chanukah story kind of begins. Where do we know all this, by the way? Could very easily think I'm just making a lot of this up. Well, as you may know, and as it's probably talked about, Chanukah is not in the Torah, certainly, but it's not in the Tanakh. It's not anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It's not like Purim. Chanukah gets compared to Purim a lot because it's a minor holiday. You're allowed to work on that day, but Purim there's a whole Megillah, there's a whole scroll, there's a whole book, Megillat Esther. There's no book like that in the Tanakh that talks about Chanukah. It comes from a book. See, this is another one of those things, right? Politics, power, corruption. Who chose the books that made the Tanakh? Well, we just kind of assume, right? Well, you talk about the Torah being written by God, but the books that came after the Torah, no one ever said they were written by God. They were human writers based on historical events, the prophets, the writings, the Psalms, the book of Ruth, the book of Esther, Isaiah, all these kinds of books. Who chose what made it in and what didn't make it in? Well, probably wasn't a very clean and necessarily smooth decision-making process, but there were a lot of books that got left out. Imagine being the writer of one of those books and you get this letter in the mail. There are 3 spots left in the Tanakh, and it's between your book and Esther. Good luck. You didn't make it. There are these 2 books, and the books that didn't make it in, they're called the Apocrypha. It's a Greek word. There was a lot of Greek translating going on. You may have heard of a group called the Septuagint. This is the collection of the translations of 70 different writers who Ptolemy wanted to do this in Alexandria. Everyone was learning, blah, blah, blah. There were a whole bunch of books like First Maccabees and Second Maccabees that were in Hebrew, that were translated to Greek. We've lost usually a lot of the original Hebrew manuscripts, but there are these Greek translations, and therefore there are these English translations, so they are books, but they didn't get put into the Tanakh. So they don't get read in synagogue, they don't get taught in Hebrew school, they don't get talked about. But these 2 books deliver the historical account of what we just talked about. There's no mention of oil. There's no mention in First Maccabees or Second Maccabees of finding this little thing of oil and oh my gosh, it burned for 8 days, how amazing. No. There's mention of Matidyahu, and there's mention of Judah the Maccabee, and there's mention of the fighting back and forth, and there's a little bit of mention of the Civil War aspect of it too. But the main thing that it says, here's an example, a quote from 1 Maccabees chapter 4. Now on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is called the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose up in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made, at the very season, and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs, harps, and cymbals. And so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days. Moreover, Judah and his brethren, with the whole congregation of Israel, ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season from year to year for 8 days, from the 25th day of the month of Kislev, with mirth and gladness. That's like the establishment of Hanukkah, the very first Hanukkah. No mention of the oil, no latkes, no gelt, no dreidel, just that key word of Hanukkah, dedication, and that it should be 8 days. So where did they get 8 days from? Well, for 3 years they had had no temple. And it's hard for us, I think, to wrap our mind around it now, but the biggest holiday for the ancient Israelites was Sukkot. It wasn't Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. People weren't buying tickets to go to shul. That wasn't a thing. It wasn't even Pesach, which you might think. It was Sukkot. It was Thanksgiving, which amazingly is today in the United States. If you think about it, the biggest holiday in the United States is not Christmas, it is Thanksgiving. And the Pilgrims came up with Thanksgiving because they knew Sukkot, the last harvest of the year, the biggest harvest of the year. It was 7 days of going crazy, and then an 8th day, Shmini Atzeret. Sukkot was the biggest holiday, not even close. In fact, in rabbinic writings, it was known as Hechag, the holiday. And when Solomon dedicated the first temple, he did it on Sukkot because he knew he'd have the biggest crowd of the year, because in those days, everybody made a pilgrimage where you ever lived in Israel, and you brought things to sacrifice, particularly for the last one of the year, to say, look, we had a great year, please can we have another great year next year, Thanksgiving. And so he had this huge crowd, and so when he dedicated Solomon the very first temple, he did it on Sukkot, so he could have an 8-day crazy party. So, a couple months later, when they rededicated in their year the temple, after taking it back from the Greeks, they basically had a belated Sukkot. 8 days. 7 days of Sukkot, 8th day of Shmini Atzeret. Nothing about oil, at least not at the beginning. That's kind of fascinating. Have you heard this story that there were arguments about how to light a Chanukah? Right? Hillel, the rabbi, said we should light it the way we do light it. 1 on the first night, 2 on the second night, 3, 4, 5, right? Shammai said we should start with the full candelabra and take away a candle each night, like a countdown, which I actually think would be kind of cool, because I don't know, I lose interest by like day 6. I'm like, day 6? Right? But the reason why Shammai was inspired to do that was because if you look at the way they practiced the sacrifices based on what it says in the Torah on Sukkot, they sacrificed more animals on Sukkot by far than any other holiday because it was the biggest deal. And every day they did one fewer bull. So on the first day of Sukkot, they sacrificed, I think, 12 or 13 bulls, and then 12, and then 11, and then 10, and then 9, and then 8, and then 7. So he was mimicking Sukkot, really, in this veiled, nowadays not known or not talked about or not popular way, because there was this really profound, strong connection with Sukkot. In fact, because of the season, we think of like Hanukkah happening when it's really cold. It was the winter, but they still had palm branches, and when they rededicated the temple with Judah Maccabee in 164 BCE, they were waving palm branches. It was like a Sukkot. It's kind of cool. And that's where they started with the 8 days. For hundreds of years, there was no mention of oil whatsoever. We don't see the oil until the Talmud. So this happened in 164 BCE. The Talmud was put together somewhere between 300 and 500 CE. So for a few centuries, Hanukkah is practiced, but is just a way to commemorate the dedication of the temple. I find that very fascinating. When the Talmud finally comes around, this is what it says. What is Hanukkah? That's how it starts. What is Hanukkah? As if no one really had any idea what was going on. Because the rabbis didn't really do rhetorical questions. It wasn't really their style in the Talmud. So what is Hanukkah? It's kind of like people don't know. For the rabbis have taught, commencing with the 25th day of the month of Kislev, there are 8 days upon which there shall be neither mourning nor fasting. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oil that was there. It was when the might of the Hasmonean dynasty overcame and vanquished them that, upon search, only a single cruse of undefiled oil, sealed by the high priest, was found. In it was oil enough for the needs of a single day. A miracle was wrought, and it burned 8 days. The next year they ordained these days a holiday with songs and praises. So after a few hundred years, the Hasmoneans get a little bit of a mention. There is not a lot of talk about the military angle of Hanukkah. Instead, Hanukkah is all about the oil. And why is it 8 days? Nothing to do with a belated Sukkot. Everything to do with the fact that the oil burned for 8 days. Joseph Caro, Rabbi Joseph Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch in Spain in the 16th century, very famous, a code of Jewish law, once famously asked, why do we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days if the miracle was really only 7 days? It's true. He was being kind of cheeky, right? Because there was enough oil for 1 day. So really, shouldn't we be excited for 7 days? It was just an interesting way that he was kind of drawing attention to the fact that there maybe are some holes in the story. Even more interesting, I mentioned Purim. Purim gets its whole tractate in the Talmud. Tons and tons of writing about Purim. Hanukkah gets like this. Hanukkah isn't mentioned in the Mishnah at all. Some people think it's because when they were putting the Mishnah together, the Romans were ruling, and that mention of like a guerrilla warfare, rebellion, resistance would not have gone over well with the Romans. They would have thought maybe the Jews are going to do this again. For whatever reason, the Mishnah, which was put together in the 200s, no mention of Hanukkah at all. And then in the Talmud, where it comes up, it's like mentioned next to Shabbat because they both have candles, or in kind of little places here and there. It's very interesting that it really did not have a prominent position at all. It was very, very minor. It really wasn't talked about a lot. As for the Hasmoneans, the Hasmoneans, their rule lasted 101 years. They took over in 164 BCE, and by 63 BCE, they had fallen into such corruption, and they had completely fallen apart. 3-4 generations that they got conquered by Rome, and Rome annexed Judea. And then Rome basically ran the area until the destruction of the Second Temple, roughly 100 years later. And it was close to 2,000 years before Jews got to rule themselves again. The Hasmoneans were the last Jews who really got to rule themselves again, and they did a terrible job. And so there are some people who also think that Hanukkah wasn't talked about a lot because The Hasmoneans really shouldn't have been celebrated. They were corrupt, they were awful. They were priests, they were Kohanim, and the rule was Kohanim should stick to the temple and not become the political rulers. But these guys, obviously, they got a little bit power hungry and a little bit drunk on the fact that they had done, maybe a good thing, maybe not, who knows, I wasn't there. But then they became the rulers and they couldn't handle the power and they couldn't handle the responsibility, and 100 years later, they were toast. And none of this really ever gets talked about. So these are some of the theories as to why the Talmud focuses on the oil and leaves the Hashmoneim almost out completely. We mention them in some of the prayers, because you can't completely leave them out of the story. But growing up, I was telling my Baba on the way here, like Matityahu and Judah the Maccabee, these are like heroes. They could do no wrong. They were incredible. And turns out they were human. Right? Turns out they were human. And that a lot of what motivated them might not have been something as pure as the Greeks are telling us we can't be Jewish. We've got to fight back on them. But that plus the power of the image of light, right? The image of light, which has really kind of always been there in the Chanukah story, really turned it into a good triumphing over evil, a light triumphing over darkness. And that time of the year, the winter solstice, when the days are the shortest, no matter where you are in the world, it was a very, very easy sell to kind of use that angle and promote and grow Hanukkah. In the research for tonight, I read this article from Forward by a woman named Shana Zamkani, and I thought she had this really powerful quote. She said, "In lighting the candles, Jews have every reason to celebrate the restoration of the Second Temple and the return of Jewish sovereignty. But the candles should also serve as a reminder of the dangers of civil war and internecine strife, a message that is especially relevant in today's political climate." Obviously a reference to, that was written 4 years ago, so a reference to what was going on in the States. But this idea that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that the political unrest that kind of gets swept under the rug as part of the Chanukah story, Jew-on-Jew crime, as I sometimes like to describe it, probably couldn't find anything more relevant, and not just within Jewish communities, but in a lot of other communities, the push and pull between traditional, the way we do it, and cultural assimilation. We want to fit in, we want to be, right? And the irony, of course, is that you could not find a holiday that now has become more based on cultural assimilation than Hanukkah, as we will describe. But there you go. That was the longest part where we're going to talk. Don't worry, we got the music. We got a little bit of music, okay? So that's a little bit of the story behind Hanukkah. Now, if I were doing this concert and my Baba were choosing the set list, I would not have started with Adam Sandler. I probably would have started with this one that covers kind of all of the fun stuff about Hanukkah and more about like what Hanukkah looks like today. So I'm going to try and do it in Yiddish. It was originally written in Yiddish in 1912, so it's a little over 100 years old, and it's translated in English and also in Hebrew. I'm going to try and do them all. All translations were provided by this woman, so if you have a problem with them, you can send your comments to her. But be warned. Festival of joy, a holiday, a happy day for every girl and boy. Spin the whirling dreidel all week long, tell the age-old story, sing a happy song. And while we are singing, the candles are burning down low. One for each night, they shed their sweet light to remind us of days long ago. One for each night, they shed their sweet light to remind us of days long ago. Oh Chanukah, come light the menorah. Let's have a party, we'll all dance the hora. Gather round the table, we'll give you a treat. City ones to play with and latkes to eat. And while we are playing, the candles are burning down low. One for each night, they shed a sweet light to remind us of days long ago. One for each night, they shed shed a sweet light to remind us of days long ago. Okay, I'll try the Yiddish. Oh, it's so embarrassing. Oy Chanukah, Yontef Hashener, Alustikir, afraid the third Tanakh Chazoiner, alle Nacht in Dreidel Spiele in mir, Hesefette latkes, Esse in mir, Geschwinder, sind Kinder, der Chanukah lichte Lechon, Zogt ala Nisim, lobt Gott vor die Nisim, kommt ihr tanzen in Korn, Zogt ala Nisim, lobt Gott vor die Nisim, kommt ihr tanzen in Korn. And just to show off, I'll do the Hebrew, right? Because you got to do the Hebrew. Yimei Chanukah, Chanukah mikdashenu, begilu v'simcha mimalei melibenu, laila vayom sivonenu yisov, suf ganion nochal gamaro, hahiru, hanliku, nerot Chanukah rabim, al hanisim ve'al haniflaot asher cholelu hamakabim, al hanisim ve'al haniflaot asher cholelu hamakabim. All right, thank you. So, the Yiddish came first. So a rough translation of the Yiddish. Chanukah, oh Chanukah, a beautiful celebration. See, she's just so disappointed. She's like, it's not even close. You're going to hear about it in the car. You're going to walk home if you're rude, by the way. 93-year-old woman shivers because her grandson, the rabbi, kicks her out of the car for Yiddish notes. Terrible, terrible thing. Like, okay, you won't walk, it's fine. Chanukah, oh Chanukah, beautiful celebration. Such a cheerful and happy one, there is none like it. Every night with the dreidels we'll play, fresh hot latkes we'll eat endlessly. Come quickly, children, light the Chanukah candles. Say Al Hanisi, praise God for the miracles, and we will all dance together in a circle. Decent?
Not bad.
Not bad. That's about as good as we get out of her, so that's okay, right? The English, I told you there's two verses. I threw out the first one that not a lot of people know, but it's this idea of Chanukah being all about festival and joy and happiness and dancing. Maybe the Menorah always gets mentioned. There's light. The dreidels get mentioned. The latkes get mentioned. It's pretty good. The Hebrew is even closer to the Yiddish translation. The most interesting thing about the Hebrew is that suf ganiyot are in instead of latkes, but the very last line. In the Yiddish, zogt al hanisim loift Gott far di nisim, right? Yeah, don't. The point is, right, say al hanisim, praise God for the miracles. In the Hebrew, al hanisim ve'al haniflaot asher cholelu hamakabim. It's because the early Zionists weren't super religious, right? So they switched God out and they replaced God with the Maccabees. Kind of cool, huh? A little bit of a stick it there. That in the original Yiddish, it's God who wrought the miracle, and then afterwards, kind of cool. But that's one of those songs that's a ubiquitous Hanukkah song, been around for a very long time, and it's great, and it sets the scene for some of the stuff that we need to talk about when it comes to Hanukkah. Some of the stories, some of the things that I always kind of wondered as I got a little bit older. Have they always been eating potato pancakes for 2,000 years? Were they playing dreidel for 2,000 years? Who decided to put menorahs in houses? Maybe if the origin story of Hanukkah has been altered over the years, updated, if you will, maybe some of the other things have evolved too. So I did a little bit of digging. Before we get into it, time for another little song. This song, so that was me trying to do, this will be my fourth language of the evening, right? No big deal, it's fine. Hold your applause, it's fine. A little bit of Yiddish, broken Yiddish, English, it's fine, and Hebrew, not bad. But now we're going to do a song in a language called Ladino. Have you ever heard of this language before? Right, of course, there's some Spanish-speaking people here who are really going to roast me later for my pronunciation. But there's this event that back when I was at the Zedek that we did every year at the Misericordia Hospital. And it was kind of like that little corner, the Misericordia, the Zedek, and Westgate Mennonite School would bring their string orchestra, their band, and their choir. Because it's amazing, like every Mennonite person can sing. It's just the craziest thing in the world. Like there isn't a single tone deaf. What they must do is if you're tone deaf and Mennonite, they convert you to Judaism or something like that, they get rid of you. I don't know how they do it. Maybe, I'm not sure. My wife's family is Mennonite, so I've been told I'm allowed to make these observations and jokes, but it's okay. But the point is, they sing beautifully and they always get together. We have this little, it's a Hanukkah Christmas combination sort of event, and my partner and my old partner and still friend, Rabbi Matthew Leibl, always sings this song called Ocho Candelicas, which is Ladino. It's 8 little candles. Ocho, 8, Candelicas, 8 little candles. I'm going to play it for you, and then the story behind it is, well, I think it's fascinating, and it sets us up to talk about a few other things. So, it was written in 1983 by a woman named Flori Jagoda, who has a very interesting story. She was Jewish American, but had escaped the Nazis in the war, and her grandmother used to teach her Ladino, so she kind of led this Ladino revival. Ladino is to Spanish, the way I always think of it is, Ladino is to Spanish what Yiddish is to German. We handle this, right? Right? Yiddish, my Bible can show you, is written in Yiddish letters, Hebrew letters, mostly like Hebrew letters, but it's more based on German than anything else. I always say people to count in German, count in Yiddish, and you'll hear it. It certainly isn't Echad, Shtayim, Shalosh. It's not even close to that at all. There is some Hebrew influence, but it's very heavily influenced by German, right? Ladino, very, very heavily influenced by Old Spanish and other Romance languages from the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, and for all of the tradesmen and everyone who was merchants and selling stuff throughout the whole Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East, Adriatic, Greece, Croatia, Italy, Morocco, Algeria, it got Turkey, it got twisted around, and it's like kind of like they call it, some people, what do they call it? I looked at Judeo-Spanish is sometimes how it's known. The original way to write it was in Rashi script. If you've ever seen how Rashi wrote it, right? Rashi script, so it's kind of like a version of Hebrew. A lot of the letters look the same, some of them are a little different. Nowadays they usually write it with the Latin alphabet, with the alphabet that we use. And there's a lot that sounds very Spanish, and there's some influence from Arabic and Aramaic and Hebrew and Turkish and all kinds of stuff. Today it's really only spoken, I found out that it's spoken, there's about, they're all over the world, but it's very small Sephardic communities, right? Ashkenazim, Eastern European Jews don't know Ladino from anything, but Sephardic Jews and Mizrahim from Spain and the whole thing, and then of course they got kicked out of Spain at the end of the 1400s. The following countries actually recognized Ladino as a minor language: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Turkey, France, and Israel. Kind of cool. And it shows you kind of what part of the world, right? So that's a little bit about Ladino. It's under threat of extinction, probably even worse than Yiddish. And this song is in Ladino. So it's called Ocho Candelicas. And, well, Rabbi Mas always used to make fun of the way that I tried to sing it. So don't make fun of me, Spanish speakers. Yo soy la langosta blanca. I can tell you the story behind that one afterwards. Baba, it means I am the white lobster. See? Right? Yo soy la langosta blanca. Okay. Chanukah linda está aquí. Ocho candelas para mí. Chanukah linda está aquí. Ocho candelas para mí. Oh, una candelica, dos candelicas, tres candelicas, cuatro candelicas, candelicas, seis candelicas, siete candelicas, ocho candelas para mí. Muchas fiestas vou fazer con alegría y placer. Muchas fiestas vou fazer com alegria e prazer. Oh, uma candelica, dos candelicas, três candelicas, quatro candelicas, cinco candelicas. candelicas y la miel. Una candelicas, dos candelicas, tres candelicas, cuatro candelicas, cinco candelicas, seis candelicas, siete candelicas, ocho candelas para mí. It's fun, right? You get to count. You get to count. And it's really, really close to Spanish. Una, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco. Right? But it's in Ladino.
Yeah, I know.
Cinco, right? Cinco, right? Seis, which kind of sounds like sheish. That's the closest they get to Hebrew. Siete, very much like, and then ocho. So it's very, very Spanish, right? So they're counting the candles. So, has anyone heard this song before? Was that the first time? No, it's new, right? It's kind of good. I mean, it's the way I do it, whatever, but it's kind of good. It's kind of cool. So it was written in 1983 by this woman named Flori Jagoda, who has this very interesting story. You'd think, oh, she was probably Spanish or something like that, right? No. She was born in Sarajevo, which was Yugoslavia at the time, and her family moved around a little bit, and she grew up in Zagreb, Croatia. And she came from a very musical family, and her mother's mother, her grandmother, spoke Ladino. Because we talked about Bosnia and Herzegovina as one of these places that recognizes Sephardic, because it recognizes Ladino. It's spread all through the Middle East. It's not just, you think Sephardic and you think Spain, but you forget that Jews from Morocco are Sephardic, and Jews from Italy are Sephardic, and Jews from Egypt are Sephardic, and Jews from Greece, and they're way more Sephardic, and they're way more in common with Spanish Jews than they do with the Jews that form my family from Eastern Europe, where this sort of thing was crazy. So she was re-exploring a story from her childhood, where they used to have these matchmaking parties for little kids during Hanukkah, where the parents would sit around and the kids would play, and they would like, oh, he's going to marry her and she's going to marry him, and they would just run around. The words, so Chanukah linda sta aquí. Where did I put the translation? Beautiful Chanukah is here. Ocho Candelicas para mí. 8 candles for me. And then they count them. 1 little candle, 2. Second one, muchas fiestas, many parties to have with happiness and pleasure. Kind of cool. And then the third line, very, very interesting, los pastelicos are little pastries to eat with little almonds and honey. This is kind of interesting. No latkes, no sufganiyot, you know, her childhood memories. And Flori Jagoda, she was born in 1923. When she was 18, the Nazis invaded Croatia. Her family got out. They got to Split, which was on the coast, and they got to a boat to an island off the coast of Croatia, and they ended up in Italy after the war, and they survived. And she was a war bride. In 1946, she met an American soldier and went back and lived the rest of her life in Virginia. But she was part of this big Ladino revival, and she wrote this song about, it was a very cool story, right? But the most interesting thing for me are like, what are these little pastries? I never had any little pastries with little almonds and honey. Where were all the little pastries? And it makes you think that like Hanukkah market for food has always been latkes, sufganiyot, and gold coins, right? And you know, brisket or something, that the main meal, right? Sephardim and Mizrahim ate totally different things. These are some of the stories never told. In Morocco and Egypt, they have this thing called zanugla, I think is how it's pronounced. Deep fried batter poured into hot oil in a thin spiral, similar to Amish funnel cakes, coated with a combination of either cinnamon and sugar or honey. In Algeria, they would fry various doughs and fill some of them with plums. In North Africa, other parts of North Africa, they had a dough rolled to resemble a rose, which is deep fried and dipped in sugar syrup or honey. In Turkey, they made something similar to a donut. In Italy, they had deep-fried diamond-shaped pieces of dough dipped in honey. And Yemenites used to make a fried carrot sauté. So all these other kinds of foods that were associated with Hanukkah, the main thing was this idea of frying in oil, to connect to the miracle of the oil that had been kind of put together in the Talmud and then perpetuated. But for her, there were these little pastries with little almonds and honey. So, no mention of soup ganiyot, but this idea of like, okay, the foods of Hanukkah. So, latkes have kind of cornered the market on Hanukkah, but latkes have only been around for not even 200 years, and Hanukkah's been around for 2,000 years. So it gets you kind of thinking, like, what's the story with latkes? I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. There's no really good latkes song, by the way. There isn't really a great latkes song, right? There's no really great latkes song. Maybe we need to write the great latkes song.
You're the man.
I'll try. So the latkes are the staple of the Ashkenazic world, right? The Eastern European world. Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, parts of Russia. That's where the latke came out of. It got brought over to America when people started leaving from there, right? So how did we get the latke? And most importantly, was the original latke potato pancake or something else? Hint, it was something else. We'll find out what it was. Okay. Latke means... No! It doesn't. Latke doesn't mean pancake, really. It means little oily. Little oily. I'll explain. You have to understand like how pancakes came to be, right? So I learned in the course of putting this all together that for as long as they've been cooking, they would just throw a little bit of like batter or dough or whatever on a rock and grill it like a pancake, right? And then when there was pottery and they could actually put it into something that was not metal necessarily at first, but like terracotta or anything like that, it improved the cooking. The Greeks had a pancake. The Romans actually had a pancake very similar to a modern pancake where they threw eggs into the mix, right? Eggs, they were using just like dough or just batter. But here they would throw flour, eggs, and milk together, maybe throw in a little bit of honey or a little bit of pepper. But when Rome fell as a dynasty, a lot of their food disappeared, including the Roman pancakes. It wasn't until the Middle Ages, medieval times, when pancakes got a bit of a revolution. And they were barley or they were rye, medieval pancakes. But they spread north from Italy throughout Europe. So the Italians got going again with these barley or rye pancakes, and then they kind of spread throughout Europe. The first time we saw the word pancake in English was in England in 1430 to describe starchy batter fried in a thin layer of fat. 1430, pancakes, England. And as people were doing this, Jewish people were doing this in all the places where they lived too. Italian Jews, they would use olive oil. And Ashkenazim in the 1300s started putting together their own kind of pancakes. Around this time, which is right shortly right when we wrote Ma'ud Sur, we talked about that at the beginning, and Hanukkah was really in everybody's kind of mind and consciousness. The two main foods for Hanukkah were fried foods, fried in oil, to connect to the miracle of oil, but also dairy food. For a long time, eating dairy on Hanukkah was a very, very big deal. Why? I will explain. But so the first pancakes were actually in Italy, were cheese pancakes. Jews who had been living in Sicily, who got kicked out because I guess Spain had a presence there during the Inquisition times at the end of the 1400s, brought ricotta cheese pancakes as they moved into northern parts of Italy. And so all throughout Italy, they're making cheese pancakes. The reason why cheese took off as being this Hanukkah-related thing has to do with another book that isn't in the Tanakh, another story from the Apocrypha that has nothing to do with Hanukkah, but people made a mistake and thought it did. It's a book of a heroine named Judith. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of this story, Judith. The story is that during it's BCE, the late 500s, like Nebuchadnezzar led the Babylonians from 601 for maybe 40 years or so, and he had this Assyrian general named Holofernes, who laid siege to this town outside of Jerusalem. Judith was a young, virtuous, righteous widow who lived in the town. She snuck into the enemy camp. She fed Holofernes a bunch of salty cheese to get him really thirsty. She then gave him a bunch of wine to get him super drunk. And then when he fell asleep in a drunken stupor, she cut off his head with his own sword. And then the next morning, when all of the soldiers saw that their leader had been killed, they freaked out and ran away. And Judith was the heroine who saved the town. Hundreds of years before the Maccabees. But in the Middle Ages, when they didn't have a written version of the Book of Judith anymore, because it didn't make it into the Tanakh, and they were just sharing this story orally, somehow it got conflated, somehow it got mixed up, and Judith was seen as being part of the whole Maccabee revolt, and that this episode was actually part of that story. And then years later, it was rewritten in, I don't know if I wrote it down. It was maybe I did. Yeah, by in a work in the 1300s called Orchot Chaim, The Paths of Life, by a fellow named Aaron ben Jacob HaKoheni, who talked about Judith, but it wasn't against some Assyrian general. It was a Greek general named Holofernes, and she did what she did, and so as a result, we eat dairy products in honor of Judith. And there are some other references around the same time, 1300s, 1400s, to eating dairy on Chanukah. So you go back to the Italians bringing their cheese. So the first pancakes, the first latkes, were cheese. The word latke comes from the Ukrainian word for pancake or fritter, which is oladka, I'm told, which itself is inspired from the Greek eladia, which means oily, ultimately from a Greek word eleon, olive oil. So from Greek down to Ukrainian, a little bit, that's where you get latke, and it focuses on the oil. For hundreds of years, it was not the sort of thing that you would eat every day. It was a seasonal treat. It was for holidays. It was something for special occasions, because they didn't have access to high quality flour, they didn't have access to baking soda, affordable oil, all that kind of stuff. So from Italy, this cheese pancake phenomenon kind of spread. In southern and central Europe, pancakes for Chanukah were made from soft cheese and fried in olive oil or butter or some kind of inexpensive oil. They were a milchik, they were dairy, and they often got served with sour cream. But you didn't have stuff like this in Eastern Europe. So this idea of having fried pancakes, of having these fried in oil pancakes for Hanukkah, made it to Eastern Europe. They weren't frying them in olive oil, now they were frying them in schmaltz, goose fat. And because they were frying them in something that was meat-based, they couldn't serve it with sour cream, and they certainly couldn't use cheese, so they needed to find something else to be the main ingredient in the latke. It started off being rye and buckwheat, and then, in the 1800s, the potato arrived. The story of the potato is very fascinating. It wasn't native to Europe, it was from South America. The Spanish brought it with them, and a lot of people for hundreds of years wouldn't touch a potato because they were freaked out by it. They thought they were poisonous. The French started using it just after the French Revolution in the late 1700s, when a famine hit and they couldn't find any other food. And then the Germans picked up on what the French were doing by the end of the 1700s, and German Jews started making potato pancakes, not necessarily for Hanukkah at the beginning, but just as something to make a pancake with. Then in 1839, 1840, more famine, Ukraine, Poland, they needed something to eat, so they planted potatoes, and potatoes took off. They were super easy, they were super inexpensive, everyone had potatoes. So they would fry them in schmaltz, they would serve it with goose or later with brisket, maybe some applesauce, some apple tzimmis instead of the sour cream, because it was a fleishik, it was a meat-based dish, and that's how potatoes really took off, and then in Germany and then into Eastern Europe. And then it came to America around the same time, mid-19th century. There are recipes, the first recipes involving latkes are in a cookbook that was published in Cincinnati in 1889 and in Milwaukee in 1901, and they were connected to German immigrants to the United States. The first time latke was ever used was in December 1916, and then when vegetable oil arrived on the scene, sour cream came back as something that you could put on latkes, so you could choose. Do you want to have the applesauce? Do you want to have the sour cream? It's not a bit of a non sequitur, but there'd be no appropriate discussion about latkes without a reference to Seinfeld and the episode where Kramer runs a Jewish singles night, and he makes all kinds of great Jewish foods, and he's very excited, and he exclaims, "You know, these latkes are going like hotcakes." It's very funny. Over time, chefs started bringing in flavors and ingredients that they never would have had in Eastern Europe. You can find zucchini latkes and cauliflower latkes and Cajun spice and jalapeno spice. And I've been to weddings where they serve the mini little latkes with a dollop of sour cream, and they probably would charge you $12.95 if you got in a restaurant or something like that, right? The debates about potato latkes, like, they really exploded, and really only not even 200 years. Not even 200 years, and it's like the Chanukah food. The debates are amazing about latkes. Minced or grated?
Yeah, combined.
Right? Do you throw the ingredients in the food processor, or do you actually sit there with a grate and kill your knuckles and all this sort of stuff? What do you put on them? Applesauce, sour cream. I've seen people eat latkes with ketchup. It's a terrible travesty. My favorite debate about latkes has always been and will always be another Halifax experience I had that first year where I got invited out to a fellow who knew me from the synagogue there. He said, come over for Hanukkah for food. I make these award-winning latkes. It was great. He came out, they served a little salad. Me and the cantor, we went together and we got along great, so it was a lot of fun. He was a nice guy. He lived with his father-in-law, though, who was very, very grumpy. It set a weird mood, now that I think about it. But the weirder part was the fact that he served a little salad, he served these award-winning, prize-winning latkes, and then he asked me if I wanted any more. And I thought, well, I don't want to ruin my appetite for the meal. Oh, I'll be all right. That was it. So the real debate is latkes a meal? I don't think it's much of a debate. The answer is no. You can't eat French fries for dinner, in spite of what my 2.5-year-old son would have you believe. Latkes are a side dish. They are a starch. Rice, fries, baked potato. These are not dinner. So if you're inviting me over for latkes, I'm expecting roasted goose or a brisket. Maybe chicken. Unless you're doing cheese latkes, in which case that would be fine. So there you go, the story of latkes, and the first latkes were cheese. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. There's no good latke song, so I'm just going to move on to the other food, the sufganiyot. I wondered where sufganiyot came from. Jelly donuts, right? That's the Hebrew word sufganiyot, always translated as jelly donuts. Though, did you know that in Manitoba, and one of the sources I use for putting this together, especially on the food stories that I find fascinating, is a book called The Encyclopedia of Jewish Food by a fellow named Gil Marcus. It's 1,000 pages, comprehensive, it's amazing, it's got the history, it's got the recipes. He mentions in his book that in Manitoba, and only Manitoba, they are called jam busters. It's crazy, right? Nowhere else in the world are these called jam busters. They're generally called jelly donuts. Sometimes they're called jam donuts. You've heard of a jelly donut being called a Berliner. Have you heard of this? So this is where the story begins. It begins in Germany. The first mention of a jelly donut is in a 1485 cookbook. The English title is Mastery of the Kitchen. Kuchenmeisterei. Not bad. That's like my 5th language today, right? No big deal. It was published in Nuremberg in 1485. It came off the Gutenberg press, right? It's pretty cool. And by 1532 it was translated to Polish. It was a revolutionary recipe because at that time all filled donuts had meat or fish or mushroom. They were all savory. This was the first sweet filled donut. And the first recipe was a bit of jam sandwiched between 2 rounds of yeast bread, which was then deep fried in lard. That's the recipe in the 1485 cookbook. Sugar became something that you could get your hands on a little more easily in Europe in the 1500s, and then especially in the 1800s, sugar beet factories started popping up everywhere. But within 100 years of that 1485 cookbook and that first recipe, there were jelly donuts everywhere in Europe from Denmark to Russia. Still mostly a rare treat for holidays. In the early 1800s, Germans started calling them Berliners. There's a story that there was this baker from Berlin who wanted to go into the Prussian military. He was turned down, but he remained as a field baker for the regiment, and they had no ovens in the field, so he began frying donuts over an open fire for the soldiers, and because he was from Berlin, the soldiers started calling them Berliners. Famously, when John F. Kennedy Jr. said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," a lot of people actually said, the real translation is, "I'm a jelly donut." It's a true story, right? Right?
Not Junior.
Oh no, John F. Kennedy, right? Not Junior, the Junior, the real one, the original John F. Kennedy, right? 1960s, right? Sorry, he's good. Thank you, for sure. And then in a lot of places they don't call them Berliners, but they call them Bismarcks, after Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. You may see this in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, places in the American upper Midwest, again where German immigrants ended up. For whatever reason in Manitoba they're called jam busters. In Britain, jam donuts, and in general jelly donuts. In Poland, they were called Paczki, I think is how you say it. Paczki, flour buds. Polish Jews didn't use lard, they used schmaltz again, or they used oil, and they called them pancakes. And in certain areas of Poland, they became the favorite Hanukkah dessert. So a Polish twist on a German invention. And then when immigrants to Israel brought pancakes with them, they exploded in popularity in Israel, and they became sufganiyot, which was the name of a spongy dough mentioned in the Talmud, sometimes called a sofgan, or sometimes called sfoga, sufganiyot. A real turning point was in the late 1920s, this story is crazy, the Histadrut, the Israeli Labor Federation, championed sufganiyot over latkes for a Hanukkah treat. Why? Because latkes were very easy to make and they were made at home. But this Israeli Labor Federation was trying to find jobs for all these people, and it took a lot more jobs it was a lot harder to make sufganiyot, so there were more jobs to make the sufganiyot, to deliver the sufganiyot. So they championed the sufganiyot, and they started this kind of rush a few weeks leading up to Hanukkah, get your sufganiyot. They became super popular. In 2009, 18 million sufganiyot were consumed in Israel, which is 3 per person in Israel. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Force alone, bought 500,000 sufganiyot in 2009. It's crazy. The greatest Chanukah stories never told. Okay, here comes another song. We're going to go back to Yiddish, because we haven't talked about the candles yet, and we only have 13 minutes, now 12. But that's okay. My Baba says that around this time of year, my Baba's a Hanukkah baby, by the way. She was born on the 4th night? I was close, 5th night. And I never knew this one growing up, but I found the music for it when she told me that she sometimes lies in bed and hears the melody. It's called Oy Ir Kleine Lichtelach. Goes like this. Kleine Lichtelach, hier der Zelt Geschichtelag, Meiselech und so. Hier der Zelt von Blutigkeit, der ihr schafft Gemutigkeit, wundervoll Amor. Wenn ich seh euch finklendig, kommt auch allem schinklendig, reden alter Treu. Du hast gekriegt Amor, du hast gesiegt Amor, Gott, das gläubt sich kaum, Gott, das gläubt sich kaum. Sie's bei dir a Tag gewinn, bist amol a Tag gewinn, hast amorig mir, hast amol a Land gehabt, hast amol gehabt. Och, wie tief das riecht, och, wie tief das riecht. Oh, ihr kleine Lichterland, eure Geschichte lacht, es sich, was wird wieder sein? Was wird wieder sein? Nice. Thank you. So a little bit of Yiddish there. The translation of that one is very interesting. Oh, you little candles, you're telling fairy tales, numberless stories. You tell of bloodshed, brotherhood, and valor, wonders from long ago. As I see you shimmering, a dream appears glimmering. An old dream speaks. Jew, once you fought battles. Jew, once you were victorious. God, it is so hard to believe. Once you were a whole people, once you were a nation. You yourself governed. You owned your land. You had a strong arm out. Oh, how deeply it moves. Oh, you small candles, your stories wake my pain. Deep in my heart it stirs, and with tears it asks, what is yet to come? Whew. It's a good one, Baba. It's a good one. So, that one with the minor and with the waltz and everything is a little bit more of a, again, kind of like there's more pain, there's more angst behind the story of Hanukkah. And it touches on a lot of the things that are in both the story that we know, but also the story that we don't know as well. There are all kinds of other little things with Hanukkah that are worth little brief mentions as we get to the end of our talk here. The menorah, for example, there's no mention of people lighting menorahs, or Chanukiot, whatever you want to call them, in the first Maccabees rendition. But of course, the menorah was central in the temple, and they needed some way of having a holiday for 8 days. There's a very good possibility that it was adopted from pagan practice. I'll never forget an eye-opening experience for me when I learned through my wife's family that the German tradition with Christmas trees was to put candles in the tree and light the candles. And I thought that's not very far off from what we do either. And being at the winter solstice, light inside, trees inside, heat, made a lot of sense, right? But there's always the stories of someone's Christmas tree fell over, it started a fire, it was terrible, and they stopped doing that. But it's very possible that having a menorah in the home was something that Jews saw non-Jews doing and started doing themselves. Josephus, if you've ever heard of him, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, which is about 250 years after the Maccabees, said that the holiday of Hanukkah was known as lights, Urim in Hebrew, and that there were menorahs, and fire in the home was a big deal, but that he didn't understand the connection between light and the Maccabees. Whatever happened, somewhere over the centuries, having a menorah in the home became a cherished household possession. By Maimonides in the 1100s, he wrote that everyone should light as many candelabras as possible, that each person should own not just one candelabra, but as many as you can, maybe 8 in all, 1 for each night. When the Nazis were coming and things like that, menorahs were often sacred and things that were kind of smuggled out or brought with them. The earliest Hanukkah menorahs were lamps of clay or stone, an opening on top to pour in olive oil and a small spout in the front for a wick. On Hanukkah, these lamps were placed at the entrance to homes or on specially constructed stands. In Talmudic times, there was a new model. It was smaller, it was a mobile version, a single lamp made of clay, stone, or maybe later metal, but it had 8 wick spouts instead of just 1. During the Middle Ages, they would further evolve. In the 1200s in Spain, a new design emerged that spread throughout the rest of the Jewish world. These menorahs were made of metal. They had an ornate back wall, so you could affix the menorah to a wall in your home, a narrow tray on the bottom with 8 dimples for oil. And these were the menorahs that first used a shamash, this additional candle to light the other ones. So, it's kind of cool. The one other thing that we have to talk about is the dreidel, which will bring us to the end of our little talk. One of the biggest stories that you get fed as a kid when it comes to Hanukkah is that the 4 letters on the dreidel, Nun, Gimel, Shin, Hey, Shin, stand for Nes Gadol Haya Sham, and that in Israel they stand for Nes Gadol Haya Po. Just a quick side story, you know this one, right? Vivon sof 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 Chanukah uchak tov, Chanukah uchak tov, Simivon sof 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 and then the middle part, right? Like Chag Simcha Hu La'am Nes Gadol Haya Sham. Chag Simcha Hu La'am Nes Gadol Haya Sham. I always wondered what they did in Israel for what's clearly a Hebrew song, right? The kids at Brockorden taught me. Sov v'sov kol v'chol Nes Gadol Haya Po Nes Gadol Haya Po Sov v'sov kol v'chol. Spin, spin here and there, right? Kind of cool. Anyway, this whole Nes Gadol Haya Sham thing, it's very cute. It was made up after the fact. It goes back to, well, they're not even sure how far it goes back. There are stories that Babylonians used to spin, like toss blocks, and once they had like their gods, Ishtar and Ninurta, and one side was winning and one side was losing. The dreidel, it really gets its inspiration from a top that was spun and used in England that was called a totem, or sometimes called a teetotum. How did it get to England? Well, it came from the Greeks in the Roman times. Some people, remember this, there was this story that we were always told as kids that they would carry dreidels in their pockets because they weren't allowed to study Torah because of all the Greek oppression, and that if they ever caught them studying Torah orally, they would just start spinning their dreidels. Maybe not so much. Maybe not so much. Roman soldiers brought the game to England. Romans were spinning these tops, four-sided, four-letter tops. The first tops had Latin alphabet Roman letters. A for offer, take from the pot. D for depone, put into the pot. N for nihil, nothing. And T for totem, take all. So it was just like the rules of the game were these four letters. It got popular in England and in Ireland in the Middle Ages. By 1801, they had turned the letters into English language. So T, same letters, but T, take all. H, half. P, put down. N, nothing. And for whatever reason, in 1800 England and Ireland, it was a very popular top to spin around Christmas time. It ended up in Germany. They changed it from English to German. G for ganz, all. H for halb, half. N for nicht, nothing. S for stell ein, or stell ein, put in. This is where Jewish kids started playing with it. They switched it from German, where they called it a trundle or something like that, to a dreidel, from the Yiddish word for spin, from drehen. They kept the same letters, g, h, n, s, but they changed it into gimel, hey, nun, shin, gimel, like ganz, all, hey, like hab, half, nun, like nicht, nothing, shin, like stell ein, put in. Just the directions for playing the game. Somewhere down the line, someone came up with the idea, Nes Gadol Haya Sham, very, very clever, a great idea, for sure. There have been other explanations for the dreidel. The ones that sound most interesting to me are this one that if you add up all of the letters, it gives you 358, which is the same gematria number as the Mashiach. Kind of cool. And someone said that each letter represents one of the four ancient kingdoms who tried to destroy the Jews. Nun for Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Hey for Haman, Persia, Gimel for Gog, Greece, Shin, though Sin, for Seir, Rome. So there's a few other explanations for these sorts of things. What does this all mean? How do we pull it all together? Well, it occurred to me that in putting this together, that the dreidel, this is the quote that I wanted to share to kind of bring you to the end. Before they kick us out of the building and turn off all the lights.
Pretty much.
That's why he wasn't just eavesdropping because he liked the dreidel story. He wants to go home. The Dreidel Game, as Rabbi David Golinkin writes, represents an irony of Jewish history. In order to celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah, which celebrates our victory over cultural assimilation, we play the Dreidel Game, which is an excellent example of cultural assimilation. So the dreidel, especially around Christmas time, and influence around, they bring it in. The menorah, very possibly that too. Even the whole idea of changing the story of Hanukkah, bringing in the miracle of oil, making it a winter solstice kind of story. The funniest thing that I always think about Hanukkah is people always kind of poo-poo it and they say, it's just a minor holiday, it's just a minor holiday, it's not really a a big deal. It's not like Passover, it's not like Rosh Hashanah. But I believe that as Judaism keeps moving into the 21st century, we're in 2021, it'll be 2022 soon, my contemporaries and younger people, I see Hanukkah as being one of the things that is the easiest to keep alive, that people actually have an interest in. It's based around the home, it's based around kids. By the way, the custom of giving gelt also has possibly has influences from what they did in the early December around a holiday called St. Nicholas in Belgium and Netherlands, where they give geld, where they give money to little kids to give to their teachers or to give to other religious leaders in the community. A lot of influences from, right? And one of the things that we studied in our program when we became rabbis was this idea of Christmas versus Hanukkah, how Christmas in North America brings so much attention, and so it's resulted in Hanukkah getting a lot of attention, and maybe this isn't such a good thing. I say lean into it. I say it is a great thing. I say that this idea of Hanukkah being a minor holiday maybe doesn't necessarily need to be true. I don't think we need to outlaw work or anything like that on Hanukkah, but I think looking at it more as, first of all, a way to uncover a lot of the stories that don't get told about Hanukkah helps our understanding of it tremendously. But I think it also, it's kind of this balance between cultural assimilation, but also staying true to what Judaism is all about. And I think it's very sellable, very marketable, and very sustainable as one of the pillars and cornerstones of Jewish life for a lot of Jews, regardless of how religious they are, today and going forward. I think Hanukkah is awesome and should be celebrated, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about some of the Chanukah stories that I don't think get told enough and only help enhance our celebration. So there you go, 9:03, and now we have to leave. All right, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the radio for asking me to be here.
Thank you so much. I want to thank again
My
Rabbi
pleasure.
Matthew Leibl for a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
Fun, interesting. I know everyone enjoyed. I just have two quick announcements. Please take home this flyer, because here you'll see the upcoming programs in this series. We have here Alan Finkel, one of our future rabbis in-house. Looking forward to his presentation in March. And next week, we're all full speed with Hanukkah. On Tuesday, we have a concert at 2 p.m. for those of you that can come. David Maslowski, accompanied by Danny Curl, 2 p.m. at the Bernie. It's a free concert, so enjoy Hanukkah, happy holidays, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you again.